I grew up in a very small, secluded town with what I guess would be a weird rule or tradition of sorts. Every Halloween, it was mandatory to leave a pumpkin outside your home along with a dead animal, usually a mouse or a squirrel. I never understood why such things were mandatory every year. I always thought that it was just to get the citizens more into the creepy holiday or scare us. Although children weren't even allowed out to trick or treat, and adults couldn't leave their houses either. Halloween was more of a bore than anything in our town. The stories of how the holiday in other towns or in the movies was so unlike ours. I never understood until a couple of Halloweens ago, and I still regret it to this day. It was All Hallows Eve, and my parents had gone out of town for the first time during this time of the year to spend Halloween with my aunt. They offered me to join them, but in all honesty, I disliked my aunt quite a bit and declined. Besides, I felt some time alone would be good for me, possibly even for relaxing. Before they left, they were very adamant on reminding me over and over again to remember to leave the small mouse and pumpkin left on the kitchen counter at the doorstep by no later than 3 in the morning tonight. One thing I did not enjoy was the part where we had to kill an animal. I loved animals, and having to see my family and others kill them yearly hurts me, which is why my parents were always the ones to do it. But this year, they would not be there to do it for me. The moment they left, I went straight to my bedroom upstairs, laying on my soft bed with heavy eyes as I watched a marathon of horror flicks. I only realized that I had fallen asleep once the sound of a loud knocking at the door filled my house with an echo. I checked my clock that laid beside my bed. It was 11:45 p.m. I'd slept for the last 5 hours as my parents had left around 6 o'clock. As I began to sit up from my bed, the knocks returned louder than before, bringing a sense of unease to well up me inside. Once I made my way to the front door where the knocks were emanating from, for some reason I felt slightly nervous about opening it. I opened the door slowly, keeping my body shielded behind the door, only letting my head peek out to see my neighbor at my doorstep with a worried expression on his wrinkling face. I just thought I'd remind you to put your stuff out before you forget. Everyone has already. Don't want anything happening to you, he states sternly before turning away quickly and making his way through our leaf-filled yard into his own as I closed the door. His words would have seemed normal if it weren't for the sentence, "Don't want anything happening to you," at the end of it. His words seemed a bit odd and threatening. Never in my 16 years of living in this town had I ever heard anyone insinuate the possibility of anything actually happening. If you did not follow the odd Halloween rules, I made an attempt at shaking his words off and just working my way towards the items on the kitchen counter. I picked the pumpkin up with a bit of struggle, as my parents had chosen quite a hefty one for whatever the fuck reason. It wasn't carved, which made it even heavier. I hadn't carved one in years. I just never had the energy or desire to make such a mess. Once the enormous fruit was placed on the doorstep, I made my way back to do what I've been dreading to do ever since my parents had told me that they would be away on Halloween. I had to kill the mouse, but I could not do it. I just looked at it, running around, almost petrified, within the clear container. My heart bled painfully, almost making tears escape from my eyes. Without any hesitation, I made my way to the fenced backyard. that was surrounded by dense forest and opened the small container to release the innocent animal. I felt an intense pride and happiness as I watched it scamper into the darkness. I hadn't thought putting out just a pumpkin was a big deal. I especially did not think laying out a freshly dead animal at our doorstep would cause any harm. Besides, it was just a weird holiday rule that was probably just meant to scare us, or at least that's what I thought. After my long nap, I found it nearly impossible to sleep, although it hardly felt like that was really the reason I could not pass out. As the time ticked away slowly, an odd sense of dread seemed to fill my bones. I made myself believe that it was simply the fact that I was home alone for the first time in a while, and I was just getting a little jumpy because of all the horror movies I had watched. But the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps from outside the front door caught my attention instantly, making my sense of dread become intense with fear I'd never felt before. It was 3 a.m. I sat on the couch in utter silence, silently shaking as I wait for whatever the fuck was outside the door to go away. The long silence was quickly taken over by a high-pitched scream that almost sounded like a banshee. The sound that filled my ears caused me to wince in pain, tears welling up within my eyes as I fell onto the floor. Once the noise had ceased, my face was weirdly numb, and wet tears covered my skin. I was quivering harshly now, gripping the rough carpet beneath me as I stared wide-eyed at the dark oak door beyond the living room. Whoever or whatever was there, almost as if it was trying to use a more simple and civilized method for entering the house, a more simple way than the sound it would made intended to use. I had locked the door, as always, so they wouldn't be able to enter. Once they realized this fact, the jiggling door went silent and still. That is until I heard loud banging from the door, but it wasn't knocking. It was as if someone was trying to break down the door. I should have ran or tried to escape as soon as I heard it, but I was frozen in fear. No matter how much my mind willed my body to move, it just wouldn't. The moment the door burst open, pieces of shattered wood flew within the house. Whoever or whatever broke down the door had been strong enough to bust a huge hole into the door, sharp wood now sticking out around it. All of this was petrifying, but what was really horrifying was what created it. What hit me first was its scent. It was rotten, like meat that had been left out for days in the hot sun. This has almost produced a gag from within me, were it not for my horrified state. The thing that crawled through the busted door was lanky and dark. Its skin almost seemed decomposing and raw. I simply stared at it as it scanned the room, as it continued to enter. Once its eyes met mine, I felt the immense fear I had never felt before returned once again. Its pupils were almost like a feline's. The rest of the eyes were deep within its head, giving an even more unsettling look to it somehow. Its stare was hungry and animalistic, as if it hadn't eaten in a very long time. This thought made my heart drop into my stomach. What seemed to confirm what I saw in its eyes was the way its snake-like tongue licked its jumble of dark, rotting flesh around its wide mouth, revealing a long line of short but sharp teeth, almost like a piranha. The second it began making its way towards me, I realized where the dragging sound had been coming from. It had one slightly long arm that held large, knife-like claws that drug behind it, leaving deep marks within its wake. I had always wondered why some years we would find scratch marks on the doormats. Here was the horrifying answer. The moment my body finally chose to listen to my mind and move, the decomposing creature's speed increased towards me. It let out the same ear-piercing scream I had heard earlier, making me squeeze my hands against my ears as tightly as possible in an attempt to block it out and keep making my way towards the door. I remember how much adrenaline had been pumping through my veins vividly as the moment the creature latched its teeth within my left hand with a near clear out. All I felt was a numb, dull ache. I don't know how it snuck up so fast, but it caught me by my hand, causing me to panic and pull away as hard as I could. I did not even think about it or even notice how it hurt me as I sprinted away as quick as I could, my legs shaking as I go to the back door. Whatever it was seemed to be distracted, devouring its new acquired treat. As I slid the back door open with a brute force I never possessed before, its piercing scream echoed within the house once more, signaling that my chances to escape were growing slim, as it was no longer preoccupied by my severed hand. As I ran through the backyard towards the gate to the front yard, I could hear its heavy steps quickly making their way behind me, its razor-sharp hand scraping within the dirt, letting out an unsettling noise that I could not possibly describe. The closer I got to the neighbor's house, the more my lungs felt like collapsing within my chest. My legs also wanted to collapse beneath me as they shook intensely from a mix of pure terror and soreness. The moment I made my way past the small gates and continued to run, the high-pitched scream that bellowed from within the beast wasn't how it was the other times I had heard it. This time it was almost warped and darker, deeper, echoing through the trees in between the houses like a large ship horn. The sound of wood breaking caused me to jump slightly as I continued running to the neighbor's yard. Nearing their door, pieces of my family's white fence began to fly around my surroundings, one of them slamming into my side with intense power. Once I finally reached the neighbor's front door, I could hardly breathe. As I banged against the door relentlessly, pleading for help, glancing behind me was the worst choice I had ever made, as the view I saw of the creature was that of the predator that was about to pounce its prey. It was almost grinning, tilting its head at me as it slowly headed towards me in an almost cocky manner. It seemed to know what I feared. It was going to get me. There was no way my neighbors were awake, and this thing would finally finish me. The door finally fucking opened, and without hesitation, I stumbled within, slamming the door and locking the various locks upon it. The old man before me didn't even get to say a single word before I started breaking down in tears. The fear that filled his eyes as he stared at me will stick with me forever. It was almost as if he knew what had happened. For some reason, whatever it was, never tried to get into my neighbor's house once I escaped within, no matter how afraid and certain that I was that it would. It simply took his offerings of a dead squirrel, made its way back through the town to my relief. The piece of wood that had hit me had actually stabbed me, and yet I was filled with so much fear and adrenaline that I hadn't even noticed, just as I had almost forgotten about my severed hand that I loved so dearly. Yeah, for jacking off. I don't live in that town anymore. My family moved away as they came home to see what had happened. Although I am no longer there, I still put out a pumpkin and a dead animal on my doorstep every year, no matter how disturbing or weird it was to the neighbors. Although I'm not there anymore, I swear sometimes I hear its screams late at night every Halloween. But maybe that's just some PTSD. I don't know. I'm not a doctor.